What it really takes is a family, and we as conservatives have to fight for the family.
A party that desires to lead this country must have an agenda that the American people believe helps them.
What is it that we can do to keep government from growing so large we can win this battle?
My name is Daniel McCarthy. I'm Vice President for the Collegiate Network here at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and I'm also the editor of Modern Age, the journal published by ISI. Our panel this morning is on a topic that has proved most vexing for the present administration in Washington, D.C. It's also a topic, of course, which has been generating a great deal of ferment and perhaps even transformative momentum on the American right. The issue, of course, is immigration, something that has a constitutive and foundational potential with American politics, and something that, for both economic reasons and political reasons, for demographic reasons and cultural reasons, is at the very heart of our discussions this weekend, and in fact, throughout the campaign season, the political season, and the policymaking season that will commence afterwards. So our panel today consists of Helen Andrews, who is the editor of the American Conservative print magazine, and the author of Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. Next to Helen is Frank Buckley, the foundation professor at the Scalia School of Law at George Mason University. His latest book, just released, is Progressive Conservatism: How Republicans Will Become America's Natural Governing Party. Last but far from least, right next to me is Michael Brendan Dougherty, a senior writer at National Review Online and non-resident fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Division at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of My Father Left Me, Ireland: An American Son's Search for Home. Thanks again for joining us this morning, and we'll begin with Helen Andrews.
Thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction. So when you hear immigration, most people think of Latin America and the border. But I assume most people in this room already have an opinion on the border. You know, it's a humanitarian crisis. You already know what you think. So I'm going to spend my time today talking about a less discussed type of immigration, and that is high-skilled immigration, because that is the kind of immigration that even many Republicans will say that they're for. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard a politician say, I want to make it harder to come here illegally, but easier for the best and brightest to come here legally. We should staple a green card to their diplomas. I'm sure you've all heard that one. That's a terrible idea. And my message to everyone here today is that you should never allow yourself to be pressured or emotionally blackmailed into supporting higher levels of white-collar immigration in the mistaken assumption that it will somehow balance out the supposed heartlessness or racism of wanting to reduce low-skilled, illegal immigration. High-skilled immigration, which in many cases means Asian immigration, is the piece of the immigration puzzle that I have a lot of experience with personally, because I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I don't know if anyone else here is, but that's the land of the Research Triangle Park. So my graduating class in high school was about half Asian, a lot of kids whose moms and dads worked at Glaxo or IBM. And then I spent most of the last decade living in Sydney, Australia, and our apartment there was in Sydney's Koreatown. So 95% of our neighbors were either Korean or Chinese or Tamil. And if you walk down the main strip, all of the shop signs were in Korean, all the people who worked in the shops were Korean. So I've had a lot of experience with Asian immigrants, not just in ones and twos, but in places where they demographically predominate. And that experience has left me with a very favorable impression of Asian immigrants. They are really great people. I can't say enough good things about them. Nevertheless, I strongly believe that immigration from Asia to the United States should be reduced, rolled back from its current level. What is its current level? Let's start our discussion there. For more than 10 years, the United States has accepted more immigrants from Asia than from Latin America. So it's really a mistake when you hear immigration to think of Latin American immigration. We take more people from China and India than we do from Mexico. Pop quiz for the people in the room. What share of the STEM workforce in the United States is foreign born? And that's across all STEM fields, engineering, math, medicine. Do you think it's 10%? Do you think it's 15%? It's actually 23%. It's just about 1 in 4. And if you look at particular fields, of course that number is higher. Software developers in the United States are about 40% foreign born. Doctors, about 1 in 4 are foreign born. For physicians, it's closer to 1 in 3. And if you drill down to particular localities, often the number goes higher. Tech workers in Silicon Valley, 60% foreign born. So this is not a marginal, minor factor in the American labor force. Certainly not if you're an American college graduate who just graduated with a degree in computer science trying to find a job that's going to give you a middle-class standard of living. And speaking of education, in STEM graduate programs, the numbers are even more lopsided. A majority of STEM graduate students in the United States are foreign born, and in certain disciplines like electrical engineering, it's up to about 80%. So why is this a bad thing? Why is this a problem if we're bringing people with these skills to the United States? There are 4 reasons, and I will tick through them as quickly as I can. The first is the obvious one, that it lowers wages and makes it harder to find a job for Americans with those skills. And keep in mind, these are the people who did everything right. You know, these are the people we told them, if you study hard, get into a good school, don't spend your 4 years in college slacking off and phoning it in your way to an English degree, buckle down, take organic chemistry, take these hard classes, and if you do that, the economy will find a middle-class place for you. These are the people, our highest achievers, our best and brightest, who are being displaced by workers who are undercutting their wages by 40 or 50%. The second reason is that it's often bad for the foreign-born workers themselves and for the companies that employ them, because it makes them dependent on a labor model that is in many ways indistinguishable from indentured servitude. Many of you may know that visas like the H-1B visa are linked to a particular company. So if you lose your job with that company, you don't just lose your job, you also you get kicked out of the country, which gives employers an enormous amount of leverage, which is not unheard of for them to abuse. One company that employed a lot of H-1B visa workers was Theranos, the Elizabeth Holmes medical fraud company. And I just want to read you a very short passage from the coverage of her trial. American and British-born scientists were fired for saying this goal is too ambitious, or quit when they realized it didn't work. Who replaced them? Almost all immigrants from India on H-1B visas, dependent on the company to remain in the country. With a despotic boss like Sunny Balwani, Elizabeth Holmes' Indian boyfriend, it was akin to indentured servitude. Sunny also had the master-servant mentality common among his generation of Indian businessmen. Employees were treated as his minions, and he expected them to be at his disposal at all hours of the day or night. So that kind of situation is bad in general, because we should not have indentured servitude in the United States. But in this particular case, you can see it was bad because workers in that situation were not able to expose the fraud that they knew was going on at that company. The word fraud brings me to bullet point number 3, which is a very sensitive topic, but I think we can't avoid talking about it. It is simply a fact that fraud and cheating and academic dishonesty are regarded very differently in China and India than they are here in the United States. Many people in this room are college students. We've got a lot of students here. Many of you probably attend schools with large numbers of international students. I am sure you have observed organized cheating rings. I was recently at an alumni event at my alma mater, and I asked students there, both international students and American-born students whose parents were Indian or Chinese immigrants, and they all said that from day one of enrolling in their classes, they were inundated with WhatsApp messages offering services of essay writing, or to sell them copies of tests in advance, or to involve them in homework rings where they would give you the answer to that week's problem set. If you talk to professors at schools that have large numbers of international students, they'll tell you, they'll tell you off the record, that for example, the test of English as a foreign language, which is supposed to test your English proficiency in order to come here and become an international student, they see students every year whose scores indicate that they ought to be proficient in English, but who, when you meet the student, can't carry on a simple conversation, can't follow a simple lecture. Professors will only tell you this off the record for a lot of reasons. One, because the schools don't want to publicize that they now have a cheating problem, but also because it can get them in trouble. I'll tell you an anecdote from the University of Maryland, just in our backyard here. A professor there at their business school ended up having to throw out all of the results of a final exam for one of his classes because cheating was so rampant. And in telling his students, in telling his class that he was throwing out all of their test scores, he expressed his dismay at the rise in academic dishonesty that he had observed in the period when foreign students from China had begun to enroll in large numbers in the business school there. That professor was forced to resign because the Chinese students whose cheating he had detected went to the administration and accused him of racial profiling. This is very common. You see it a lot at the UC schools in California, which also have large numbers of foreign students from China. They have learned that if you cry racial profiling, it can insulate students from scrutiny into cheating and make life hell for any professor who accuses you of it. So this kind of fraud is under-discussed, and it's important to talk about it, even though it's a difficult issue. One, because cheating is contagious. If I don't want to see the stigma on cheating erode in America to the levels where it is in India and China. Two, because it's not going to stay on campus. It's going to follow them into their careers as pharmacists or researchers, and at that point it starts affecting all of us. But the third reason, which is under-discussed, I will have my final quote where I'm reading. There's a pseudonymous blogger called the Education Realist who teaches public school out in California who writes a lot about Asian cheating. And he said something very moving. He said, in the traditional weeding out courses in STEM majors in colleges, like organic chemistry for pre-med, the willingness to accept cheating is convincing a lot of American kids that they aren't smart enough for tough courses because they don't cheat and they aren't aware that others do. So that's who I think about when I think about the rise of cheating and how it affects the rest of us. My final fourth bullet point, which I will dispense with in 30 seconds, is that the Asian American vote in the last presidential election went Biden over Trump something like 70-30. Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, Korean Americans, I think it was closer to 80-20. And this is a persistent pattern that we observe in election after election, even in cases where you might expect it to go the other way. We had the gubernatorial election in Virginia very recently, Terry McAuliffe versus Glenn Youngkin, and I heard a lot of Republican analysts expecting that Asian parents were going to tip for Youngkin because education was a big issue in that election. And Youngkin really staked his campaign on saying, I'm against CRT, I don't want any of that nonsense. And of course, Asian parents hate CRT. And Youngkin was saying, I'm going to teach your kids what they actually need to know. I'm not going to get rid of selective admissions at schools like TJ. Do you think Glenn Youngkin won the Asian vote? Do you think he broke even on the Asian vote? When the exit polls came out, Glenn Youngkin's share of Glenn Youngkin won 30% of the Asian vote. So I know a lot of people, a lot of conservatives who think that Asian American voters should be Republicans because they tend to be wealthier, they've got great family values. I agree with that. I think they should be. I think everybody should be, but I think they should be. But we can simply observe that they're not. And if there's any fundamental lesson we can take away from decades of failed immigration policy, it's that when we invite people to come here, we're not just inviting workers, we're inviting our neighbors, and we're inviting our fellow citizens. And so the fact that their voting record tips so heavily for one party over the other is not something that we can ignore.
Thank you, Helen. So Frank Buckley has given more thought than almost anyone else to the future of the political parties in this country, in particular the Republican Party, which he has discussed remaking as a workers' party. And his new book, of course, is on progressive conservatism. Frank is himself an immigrant from Canada, and so I'm very interested to hear his perspective on the politics and dynamics of immigration.
Yeah, I think I'm here because I'm an immigrant. Are there any other immigrants here? Anybody else? Okay, where are you from? Okay, all right. Well, so I'm here to talk about immigration from a conservative perspective, which raises the prior question of what is conservatism, because they come in different forms. Some are noble and some are ignoble, and some are progressive in the tradition of Lincoln and TR and Eisenhower, and some are reactionary. And then there's the still prior question of what is it which makes one an American? Because if you thought, for example, that this is a white country, then what you would want is a pro-white immigration policy. But that can't work because that is illiberal, and that which is illiberal is not American. And the reason for that is because that which constitutes our identities as American is fidelity to the principles of the founders. Lincoln knew that. In a speech on July 4, 1858, he spoke to a group of people, some of whom were descended from the people who had fought in the Revolution, and some of whom weren't. And he said, the difference doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because everyone who subscribes to the principles of the founders is an American. That, he said, is the electric cord which unites all Americans. Right? Now, some of you may disagree with me. You may say, well, that's called creedal nationalism. And that doesn't work because we're more than an idea, we're a people. Right? And that's true, but but if you ask, what is that common culture which unites us, you might struggle to find it, right? I don't want to play into the culture wars, but I suspect that there are a lot of Americans who think that if it really just is a matter of a common culture, then perhaps we are or should be secessionists. That would be more logical, wouldn't it? Unless you think that that electric cord still holds, in which case not only does it unite us, but it can also provide the kind of emotional valence which binds us together in the sense that we know we are one group of people, right? So if we are conservatives in that sense, we don't fear being replaced. We know that we've always been replaced and we're the better for it, or at least no worse, right? So we are not the kind of European nationalists like Eric Zemmour or anyone like that. That would be un-American, right? It would be contrary, certainly, to Lincoln's idea of what it is which makes us American. So if we want immigrants, we'd like people at a minimum to subscribe to those principles. But that's not enough, right? Because in addition, you'd want immigrants who are going to make Native Americans, American citizens, better off. I don't know if I did, by the way, but I don't care. All right. So, what you'd want, in short, is a screening mechanism of the kind that progressive conservatives in Canada adopted with the point system and subsequently exported to Australia, and which was supported by Trump and proposed by Tom Cotton. Right? And how does that work? Well, you're awarded points for a lot of things like, are you young? Do you speak the language? Do you have a job? Are you willing to settle in a province where, your skills can be needed? So all of those kinds of things put together make for a better kind of immigrant, right? And richer Americans. And, the problem right now is we're impoverishing ourselves by our legal immigrant cohort. Forget the illegals. Just think about the legals and the 1965 immigration bill, right? The most respected immigration economist, George Borjas, has run the numbers, and he said, surprisingly, it's kind of a wash. There are gains to winners and losses to losers amongst Native Americans, but the gains pretty much equal the losses. But that's not the whole story, because the losses come off the back of the most fragile of Americans. So what Bohr has concluded is that our present immigration system amounts to a vast wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. And yet the Democrats, who like things the way they are for political reasons, get to preen in their pretended virtue. I mean, that's just shocking, or it should be shocking. Unless you're so inured to hypocrisy at this point, nothing can shock you, right? So we'd want people who are going to make American citizens better off. And by the way, one thing, which won't suffice is simply comparing them to ordinary Americans, right? Because half of American adults can't read at a grade 6 level. So saying that, the immigrants are better than that is not exactly making a very proudful boast. There's a vast pool of potential immigrants who are much more educated than that, and we're sending them to pro-immigration countries like Canada and Australia, right? And by the way, when that happens, when you have those kinds of laws in place, what happens is, the citizens of the country don't feel so bad about immigration. It's not a political issue. And in fact, they have a much more generous immigration policy, right? So in terms of the rubric on which you admit people on the basis they'd make ordinary people better off, Canada in absolute numbers imports more economic migrants than the United States, 190,000 a year in Canada, 140 here. That's for the country 1/10 the size. And because Canadians are pretty happy with the way it works, they're also more willing to admit refugees, right? 30,000 in Canada versus 10,000 here. I think that's deeply shameful. And, and by the way, the refugees we're talking about are the people who are kind of mucked up by American wars. So, this is something that should be shameful, I think, a little bit. All right? So, in sum, what I've argued is there's no great mystery about what a proper immigration policy would look like, right? It's the point system. It was proposed by Senator Cotton in 2017. By the way, he got only 33 votes on that one. There is a reason why the GOP is called the stupid party, okay? So, it isn't really rocket science. It's really not all that hard, right? And particularly so for people who believe in that electric cord and Lincoln's idea of nationhood, right? And if you do, it all makes sense. And if you don't, then I have a Peytonist question for you, as proposed about Lincoln. Êtes-vous plus américain que lui? So, that's it.
One of the canards that is often lobbed against conservatives is the idea that they are xenophobic or lacking in cosmopolitan finesse. And this panel demonstrates, of course, that isn't true. Not only given Frank's own background, but also Michael Brendan Dougherty is someone who's written very sensitively about his Irish-American heritage and, in fact, about Ireland itself. And his father, lives in Ireland. Michael, what are your thoughts on immigration and on, the very nature of sort of citizenship and what immigration means for it?
Well, I wanted to build a little bit almost to the side of what some points Helen brought up, which is that there are almost two foundings of America, and we talk about one founding, the political founding. We talk about the founders, the framers of our Constitution, the heroes of our Revolutionary War. But there is another way to look at America, which is to look at Sir Thomas Smith, the first governor of the East India Tea Company, as a major influence on America. America was founded first as a commercial enterprise, almost exclusively. And one way of looking at the American story is this conflict between the commercial enterprise and the political enterprise of America. And on the commercial side, there has always been a category of exploitable labor that lacks the rights of citizenship. We've seen this in indentured servants. We later saw it most horribly and most shamefully in chattel slavery. And what we see is it emerging again and again in American history in the company towns where workers were reduced to little more than serfs who had to rely on company bucks and fake currencies not tied to the larger political system to obtain the necessaries for maintaining a family life, a biological life able to serve the company exclusively. And we see this emerging again in the malign neglect at the border and an exploitable class of undocumented workers. We see them living beyond the reach of the law. One of these embarrassing stories in the last few weeks that we never would have heard about unless it were for the Dobbs decision was the story of a 10-year-old in Ohio who was raped by what we presume to be the boyfriend of her mother, and then she had to go across state lines to obtain an abortion. We never would have heard this story were it not that America's newly emerged abortion laws shone light on it. But what you saw are people that are living undocumented lives and do not have normal access to the law, to the courts, to our system of governance. This neglect has had effects on our social life that mask real economic problems. The lack of rising wages since the 1960s, not long after the Immigration Act passed, has been partly compensated for by exploitable labor that is used to give people in New York on middling salaries the kind of simulation of a servant class, whether they're doing laundry, child minding, or other things. We see this in other countries too. I mean, Poland has now embarked on this with a kind of guest worker program they've been running with Ukrainians for years now that gives people a sense that they're living aristocratic lives on middle-class salaries. But it is inconsistent with a Republican ethic, a small r Republican ethic, and it should become inconsistent with Republican politics, with a capital R. The Republican Party was partly founded with the help of free soilers who wanted free labor and free men. It is they wanted one legal American labor pool where everyone could compete equally, where there was not a helot class that was brought in specifically to lower wages for everyone else or to advance certain industrial or corporate interests. We cannot maintain a democracy with such a class. And this story has been repeated in 1,000 ways. Personally, in my own life, I have a family member who in the 1980s became a carpenter and a general contractor. He was chased out of that industry because he had the scruple of wanting to hire legal labor on his teams, which eventually priced him out of the market in New Jersey. He had to find completely new line of work, and he did adapt and succeed in making custom furniture for even richer customers on an individual basis. But simply following the law in the United States should not be a barrier to success in a commercial venture in the United States. This fundamentally erodes our Republican spirit, and it is almost the eternal battle in the United States. And that's basically all I have to say. We have this tradition in Republican politics, a kind of liberating tradition where we look at people as equal citizens with equal access to the law. Our immigrants deserve just as much now, and we should not allow Democrats to take a moral posture above us. They basically say, well, we have to allow immigrants into the country, even illegally, because stopping them is in effect shoring up white supremacy. In fact, their vision is deeply inegalitarian, and any society in the world that falls into the trap of using exploitable labor classes becomes a far more unequal and far less democratic society. I mean, if you look at how Qatar prepared for the World Cup games with tranches of different exploitable labor from the Philippines, from sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, all gradated into finely racial hierarchies. That is the alternative model to what the American model of free soil, free men, and free labor. It's a tradition the Republican Party desperately needs to recover for itself today.
Thank you, Michael. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, and I encourage everyone in the audience to start thinking about questions you'd like to pose to our panel, and perhaps even to start lining up at the microphones. In the meantime, however, I have a couple of questions myself that I'd like to direct to our panelists, and I'll start with Helen. What do you think of the point system and the Canadian approach to immigration that Frank has discussed? Would that be an optimal approach for America, or should we have other principles that should guide us in our immigration policy?
I think a point system is fine. I lived in Australia, which also is a nation of immigrants, as we are, and the point system seems to work fine. Certainly better than the chain migration or family-based migration that America has. But once you decide, there are always two questions in immigration policy. One is who, and the second is how many. And the question of family versus points versus skills versus whatever is only, related to question one. And question two is in many ways the more important one.
So Frank, I'm curious to hear from you what you think the political prospects are for immigration reform as you've described it, especially since it seems as if Tom Cotton was not very successful in getting as many sponsors as he might have liked for his proposal. Do you think that this even has perhaps sort of cross-partisan potential? Is there a chance that anyone on the left, I mean, it seems to me that people like John Judas and a few others are progressives who are quite critical of some of the ways in which our immigration system works right now, especially in feeding corporate America rather inexpensive labor. So what are the political prospects for the ideas that you've presented?
Well, there are no prospects of democratic support for that which would subvert the left wing's great replacement theory, which is one of replacing Republicans with Democrats, and they're quite candid about that. So no, that's not going to happen. As to whether or not the GOP would wise up, I don't know. I even had problems with the Cotton bill. It was restrictionist. It put a cap on the number of people one would admit. Helen would do the same thing. I can't understand why that should be the case. I mean, I put to you a potential immigrant who is won over whatever that bloody limit was, right? And he is somebody who's going to make Native Americans better off, and we're opposed to admitting him. Why? It makes no sense to me. So I think it's important to see the problem as one of quality and not quantity. That's precisely what the point system is all about. Yes, I'd like to see more immigrants, but a different kind of immigrant.
Okay. Michael, I think the libertarian critique of your position would be simply to say that instead of having people who are kept in the shadows and don't have full access to the law, you should simply legalize and, sort of open, the country to as much immigration as possible and to give newcomers the same status that citizens have in a very generous and broad way. What's your sort of response to that libertarian, rather open borders or universal citizenship model?
Yeah, I mean, the Wall Street Journal's, former editorial position of a constitutional amendment, there shall be open borders, is just utopian nonsense. It's hard to engage with it. Immigrants have a great destination in America. They are accepted more quickly here than just about anywhere else and integrated more quickly anywhere else. But they do so by being involved not just legally but socially. A total free-for-all would, of course, be selecting for immigrants almost exclusively from Mexico and Central America rather than from all over the world. I don't think that we need, I don't think that is the healthiest policy, is to choose immigrants all from one or two countries or regions. And again, I mean, the hopes of immigration utopians have typically been dashed. I think Charles Francis Adams, at the beginning of the founding of the Republican Party, he'd said that they had hopes, his kind of political set, who were so excited at the founding of what they saw as a truly national party, one that kind of escaped the prejudices of the Adams men that kind of ran just from Yale to Bowdoin on the East Coast and could speak to the whole nation. He said that they had this view that you could make an American out of an immigrant in just 7 years. that all of his affections and habits would be transferred. At the end of his life, around World War I, he gave a speech saying, no, in fact, it usually takes about 3 generations for immigrants to fully assimilate into the country. I mean, and in effect, to fully become as available to both parties, to the contrary impulses and cultures that have tension, creative tension with each other in the United States. So there has to be some limit to do it orderly. And frankly, because we don't also have the resources. America is per capita the richest country in the world. We have standards for what our hospital care should look like, what our schools should look like, and an inundation of tens of millions of immigrants a year, which is what I would expect with fully open borders, would cause us to have to sacrifice those standards of care almost immediately to meet the demands rushing in on us. And to do that, of course, you would have to abandon democratic wishes of the American people, who for almost 2 generations now, when you poll them, they poll for less immigration than we are currently getting.
Frank.
Well, let me say something again about the point system. And the point I want to make is it really is quite racially neutral, right? And it's also politically neutral, too. We should not care, as other panelists do, whether or not the immigrants will vote Republican or not. That shouldn't matter, right? What should matter is whether or not they'll make ordinary Americans better off, right? And this also speaks to something that Michael said, and a basic distinction between 2 ways of thinking about the GOP. One traces its roots back to the idea of Republican virtue and the framers in 1776. And the other sees, which perhaps traces itself back to Federalist 10, to America as a group of different races, different groups. It's called pluralism, and the idea is we'll all have a seat at the table and we'll all bargain. And that really is the Democratic Party. I mean, we should be, as Republicans, better than that and aim for the common good without regard to party, without regard to anything other than, is this going to make Americans better off?
Helen, did you want to respond to that?
Just that if I care how they vote. Yes.
It seems like the Democrats perhaps care as well, and that.
I've heard rumors to that effect.
Well, then you're like the Democrats, which is not a compliment.
Let me ask about the cultural dimension of this. So it seems to me that one of the concerns that many Americans have is that in the past we have had a strong enough civic culture that assimilation has had real potential. And now we perhaps have a culture or even a political background that encourages disassimilation and that encourages, to think of America as founded not in 1776, but in 1619, that this is a nation of fundamental inequity, and therefore the people who come here should actually think of themselves as redeeming what is otherwise a sinful nation. Can we have, to what extent does a very, frankly, anti-American educational system and tendency within our culture war complicate the prospects for immigration? Can you have the same levels of immigration when you have this kind of, adversary culture as you would if you had a more strong, assimilative educational ethos in this country?
I have 2 quick responses to that. One is to suggest that everyone look up an article written in The Atlantic by Reihan Salam, who's now president of the Manhattan Institute and has done more deep thinking on immigration than just about anybody else on the right. He's great. And in this article, he suggests that the reason why so many recent immigrants are so quick to spout CRT bromides and talk about America as an irredeemably racist country is because that's what assimilation means today. Especially if you want to assimilate into high-status elite circles, that's what they sound like, so that's what you should sound like as well. And the second is to add to your point about assimilating into American culture and double down on it. Talking about STEM graduate students and the large proportion of them that are foreign-born. Bringing in those foreign grad students used to be a good bet for the United States economically, because when they graduated, if we gave them the right to stay here, they would. Because it was better to live here than to go back to China or wherever they were from. That's no longer the case. It's just in the last 10, maybe 20 years that you start to see large numbers of foreign students at American universities who say, when I graduate, I don't want to stay here. I want to go back to China because I think my prospects will be better there. So that also dramatically reduces our ability to assimilate, especially the most elite immigrants, into American society.
We have a good number of questions from the audience starting to line up, but I want to give Frank a chance to talk about how Canada handles this cultural difficulty, because I know that they face some of the same issues that we do, and then I'll go to Michael after that.
Well, cities like Toronto are much more multicultural than most American cities. I mean, and the foreign-born population in Canada is 20%, which is much higher than here. So somehow it works out because there's a general acceptance of the idea that Canada is a pretty decent country. Maybe that's the difference here. But why don't we go to questions?
Well, let's give Michael a chance to have some comments, and then we'll...
I would say there absolutely is a problem with the culture of opposition that is within America, but it's also perhaps a creative one because it allows Americans to make themselves more diverse even without immigration. I mean, Senator Elizabeth Warren somehow became Native American just because of the demands for diversity that existed. But in fact, we laugh. But in fact, we are starting to see many students who normally would have conceived of themselves as white searching for other ways to rehyphenate their identity or to add themselves to this broader category of person of color, which really should be seen as the person of color identity is sort of as deracinated as white identity. In a way, and it is a kind of shabby attempt to include new immigrants into the historic Black American experience, which would be otherwise inaccessible to them. It is providing just a little bit of power for some progressive politicians now, but I think it is a project that's doomed to failure.
Okay, let's go to audience questions. We'll start over here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful panel. So we have a question from the app for Helen. And someone is wondering, can you talk about how colleges benefit financially through student visa programs such as OPT?
That's a lob across the plate. No, that's an easy question, setting me up for one of the major under-discussed factors fueling the rise of international students at American universities, and that is that they are cash cows. Because those students are not eligible for a lot of forms of financial aid, so they pay full freight. Their parents are usually elites back in their home countries, so they have the money to put into this. So colleges are willing to admit students that they know do not have the English language skills to make it or to do the coursework. But because they're paying so much money, they're subsidizing the school, so that's why they keep them there for as long as they can, which is frankly predatory on the part of the schools and is just immoral. It's the easiest thing to condemn in this whole equation.
Shall we take a question from stage right?
Sure. Helen, you mentioned an interesting statistic that despite it seeming to be in Asian Americans' interest to vote Republican, they are overwhelmingly voting Democrat. In recent years, that doesn't seem to be the case, or at least quite as much the case with Hispanics, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. I'm curious what you and what other people on the panel think is the explanation for this kind of recent divergence in the way Hispanic immigrants and Asian immigrants are voting.
Yeah, I think that is not what a lot of Republican consultants would have predicted, that we would see large movement to the GOP among Hispanics before we saw it among Asians. That is contrary to what a lot of people foresaw. I'm heartened to see many Hispanics moving to the GOP, and I think hopefully that will have a salutary effect on the party. However, I do note that it took decades, took generations for that to happen. So you can tell me, as many Republican consultants have told me, that eventually Asian Americans, Asian immigrants who came later than Hispanics will follow the same trajectory, and eventually they'll wind up with a less lopsided voting record. But again, if that takes another 30 years, that's a really long time to wait, and I'm not entirely sure it'll happen. So yeah, it's weird, and I have no explanation for it.
I also think it's partly changing the composition of Hispanic immigration to the United States with more political refugees from leftism coming out of South American. I mean, just speaking personally, the most right-wing member of my family is of Venezuelan extraction. By far, she makes all of us on this stage look like squishes.
And actually, do you know the only Asian American demographic that's more solidly Republican?
Vietnamese.
Vietnamese Americans.
So, same thing. So, I think that is part of the reason. And we saw, much to my surprise, I thought Trump's invocation of socialism as a threat to America, his promises that America will never be socialist, I thought this was the worst sort of boomer nostalgia imaginable, but in fact it had much broader appeal than I expected. So that is part of the reason, and so that means it can be changed. I mean, we could change the composition of who's entering the country again and have a different political effect.
Frank, would you like to comment on this question, or shall I go to the next one?
Well, part of the problem is the GOP is so bad at reaching out to non-traditional voters. And, they might take a page from one of my friends, a guy called Jason Kenney, the former premier of Alberta, who was extraordinarily good at, reaching out on behalf of the Tories to the Asian community, to the extent that he was called Curry in a hurry. I mean, if there was any kind of Indian event, he was there. Right, and if you look at pictures of the Tory front bench, you'll find quite a mixture of people. Happily, it's beginning to happen here, but it's more a case of them butting in than the GOP reaching out.
Let's go to a question from stage left.
Yes, so I tend to follow migration issues through an economic lens. And for example, like migration versus trade and productivity being sort of the great strategic options on this, in my perspective. So focusing on immigration only here, to what extent does immigration tilt the level playing field in the US economy towards capital? And the important thing about immigration, so to speak, is not the individuals or necessarily the culture, but the fact that immigrants gain enormously by just getting off the airplane. They will work for decades. There's a Wall Street Journal story a couple of years ago where clever Koreans sign up to work in American slaughterhouses for a decade or more in order to get green cards on the rational basis that all their children forever unto the end of time will be American. That's a colossally big benefit which Americans have no clue about. But in this context, the offer of this award, A Life in America for You and Yours Forever, is a gigantic economic thumb on the scales for white collars and blue collars. And amongst other things, it means there's less investment in the middle of the country, there's less investment in productivity, yada, yada, yada. So in that context, how can the coexistence of, in what way can you adjust immigration to minimize distortion to the free market or free labor in the United States?
Is that a question for me? I don't understand the question.
Well, I think the question is, to what extent does immigration as we have it now create an imbalance between capital and labor that favors capital very strongly over American native-born labor? And what policies or what approach could remedy this difficulty if it's a real thing?
Well, it's difficult to unpack all that. One of the problems with a system that imports people on the basis they'll make Americans or Canadians better off is giving extra points to people who bring money into the country. And that may be your capital versus labor problem. And it's been discovered in Canada, for example, that creates all sorts of problems. The Canadians are giving up on that. What it's meant is basically housing prices in Vancouver have gone crazy because people from Hong Kong are buying a little pied-à-terre and then, going back to Hong Kong. They have no intention of living there, but they're going to buy up all the property. I'm more concerned about the distributional effects of all of this and the way in which the immigrants, and yeah, they have wonderful values, people coming in, even illegals, which is why they tend to become conservative. But it's such a wealth transfer from poorer Americans, and particularly African Americans, right? That I think that should be a real concern. There are other spillover effects as well. We're importing immobility. The people who are coming in will earn less than Americans, and their children will earn less than American children, and their grandchildren will earn less than American grandchildren. And we also have an absolutely horrible educational system, a K-12 system, right? And countries with a better immigration system like Canada absolutely beat the pants off us. And that's in large measure because of a different immigration system, more importantly because of that, right? On any category you might measure on OECD tests, we underperform just about every other first world country except in one category, and that's self-esteem.
One way to look at the question is, a lot of economists have been saying, well, you have roughly 80% of the capital concentrated in America and Europe, where there's 20% of the people, and 80% of the people in the rest of the world have about 20% of the capital. And so we have to find a way to invest in the rest of the world, in the emerging markets, or else we'll just see this effect of more and more people making a rational choice to do whatever it takes to get into Europe and America to improve the prospects for them and their children. And on a superficial level, that is of course true. The difficulty is that it's harder to get capital investment into the developing markets so long as they remain politically much more corrupt than what you would find in Germany and the United States. The more skimming, the more schemes, the harder it is to make that investment fruitful and make it work for people. The other side of this, I wonder if, given the way birth rates are just collapsing across the entire planet, we may also see a kind of forced change on us where countries that spend a significant amount of money educating their young people in the developing world no longer want to see the brain drain. It no longer is worth it to them to see the brain drain. Their most productive, most ambitious, smartest people leaving to become, nursing home workers in Europe. And they may limit emigration. That's a future we should begin to at least contemplate. That if your entire model of American economic growth in the future is dependent upon super high levels of immigration, we know there's tons of demand for it, but there are ways that the world can limit the supply too.
Before we go to the next question, let me ask a variation on this of Helen. Is America capable of producing enough STEM workers, enough of the kinds of workers our economy needs today to meet our demands, or do we have to turn to immigration if we want to have the kind of economy that we do?
This is a question that you get a lot if you raise this point, and I point to the last panel, which I hope you all were listening to. Orrin Cass talked about the misallocation of talent and how so many Americans with these math skills are ending up in finance and not, instead of actually making things or inventing new things. And that is absolutely true. If you look at finance, you see large numbers of native-born Americans who have the brain power, are good at math, but they've been drawn into that industry because the money is there and because they feel more comfortable there. So if we redirected some of those people into STEM fields and then kept them from turning their STEM degrees into a reason to go back into finance, we would have more than enough STEM workers. There is no shortage of people in America who can hack it in these fields.
Let's go to the next question from the audience.
Thank you. And Dan, I think you kind of took my question, so I'll go on a different tack. We're talking about immigration right now, but what should we do about how many folks are already here, kind of living outside the law, as Michael brought up, very poignantly, this tragedy and the risks and the humanitarian crisis, not just at the border, but also throughout the country of people who live in the shadows. What is to be done?
I mean, the conventional answer in Washington has always been comprehensive immigration reform, the promise of border enforcement later, for amnesty now. Listen, I am sympathetic to some of of course, to some of the people who've spent their whole lives from early childhood in America. They really are alienated from their parents' country, and they really do, in a sense, belong to us. I have total confidence in American assimilation efforts as well, culturally. In fact, we're almost assimilating too much. We're assimilating beyond our borders. I mean, we are a global hegemon whose media is determining and reshaping values across the world, not always to the world's benefit. I mean, Marvel movies are not the most heroic stuff for people to read. But I expect that there would be some compromise where you have some level of legalization for those, some here illegally, but there's no way to get that credibly until you secure the border and until you begin deporting criminals. This criminal I mentioned in my talk and who's kind of in the headlines, there's almost no chance he would be deported at the end of his trial, even if found guilty or after his sentence is served. There's no chance at all right now until the United States can do border enforcement credibly, until the left can accept that it's not white supremacy to insist upon the rule of law. It's going to be very difficult for Americans democratically to accept any kind of giant amnesty again, because we've already been fooled once in the 1980s, and now we'd be taking a much to take that much more egg on your face a second time would be ridiculous.
Obviously, mandatory e-verify, things like that are great methods of enforcement. But one I want to throw out to the group, because it's not often discussed, is that right now a lot of illegal migration is dependent on social media. The cartels and the coyotes, they use WhatsApp or they advertise on Facebook. And the tech companies have said, we're going to allow this to continue, even though most of this activity is illegal that we're facilitating, on the off chance that some of them might be legitimate refugees. So it would be possible to get these tech companies to crack down on what is essentially illegal activity on their platforms. It's bizarre that you have so many people on the left saying we need tech companies to police disinformation, your boomer grandpa's Facebook posts or whatever, but have no demands that they crack down on the criminal model that really rests on those platforms and could not operate without them.
Frank, do you want to add anything? Okay.
Well, just one thing. We'd be remiss if we didn't pay tribute to one person here in the audience who got it consistently right. And I think I see Jeff Sessions down there in the audience, so my thanks to you, General Sessions.
We'll take a question from this side of the room.
Yes. Hello. This question is for Helen. Just a quick couple of stats and then a question. In regards to your anti-Asian immigration stance, Indian immigrants represent less than 1% of US citizens. However, they comprise 9% of our startup founders with companies that achieve valuations of at least $1 billion. The unicorns of Silicon Valley. And on the company side, Google, Microsoft, Adobe, IBM, Palo Alto Networks, and now Twitter for now, are run by CEOs who grew up in India. These places are not hiring CEOs for their diversity values. Their board of directors are hiring for competency, and venture capitalists are in it to make money. And they're funding top companies only. Don't these outsized results dispel even just a bit of your narrative that we want less of them? Because, by face value, they seem to be 10x citizens, at least on the business side, when compared to US-born citizens. Thank you.
Yeah, those are great stats. You mentioned Microsoft and Google having Indian CEOs, also MasterCard, also Pepsi, also Adobe. A ton of Indian CEOs, and a lot of them are great. One that you didn't mention was Rajat Gupta, the head of McKinsey, who ended up going to prison for insider trading for passing privileged information to Raj Rajaratnam over at Galleon trading. That was not maybe a great moment. But it's simply not that useful to talk only about these very gifted CEOs, as the heads of Twitter and Google and Microsoft all are, because that's a very small segment of tech and any tech company, the people who really are so extraordinarily gifted that they end up being the CEOs. 1 in 4 STEM workers being foreign-born, that's kind of where the policy discussion should be, because a lot of those people are not. H-1B visas are premised on the idea that they are specialty workers, right? You can bring in H-1B workers if you can't find Americans to do the job that you need to do. If you talk to anybody who actually works in a company with H-1Bs, they'll tell you that that's rarely the case. So it's not the exceptional people, the CEOs, that are distorting the labor market to the detriment of native-born STEM workers. It's the masses. It's the 1 in 4. So that's really where we should be looking when we decide policy, not on the basis of either Sundar Pichai or Rajat Gupta.
So we have just 20 seconds left on the clock. If Frank or Michael would like a one-sentence concluding remark, I'll give you a chance to. Very good. Michael, anything?
No, not at all. I would just say, going forward, we should actually, the point systems are very, they are self-recommending, but conservatives should put a word in for family reunification too, that it's not, there are ways to limit it to make it more sensible. People thrive in the context of extended families. That doesn't mean that you have to extend benefits to someone's second aunt once removed if they bring them in through chain migration. That's not the way it should be done, but people bringing in their spouse or even a brother, that can be a good way of bringing people in who will be included in your society in some way. We're not just, we shouldn't allow the commercial logic to dictate every bit of immigration policy.
And Frank, I know you've got a...
Yes, I've criticized the non-creedal nationalists. So let me say some positive thing about that which is special about America, which doesn't get down to a creed. That is the American sense of exuberance, which brings people here, and which is so much more fun than Tory pessimism. I'm talking about the America of La Jolla Cove and Bourbon Street and South Beach, and all the wonderful vulgarity and fun of America, which attracts people here, and which is as well constitutive of what it means to be an American.
Well, on that optimistic note, we will conclude this panel. We are now at break until 1:30 p.m. For lunch on your own. And at 1:30, we'll be back here for a Writer's Shade of Green, Conservatives and Conservation. So thank you very much.